Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be looking at putting together this steampunk mask. Now I think it might be better if I take this off before I continue, so let me just quickly get rid of this. So that comes up, comes off. And I've got some thumb screws here which should allow me to take this off. There we go. So I can see what I'm doing. Right, so there we go. So yeah, this is another steampunk mask, helmet, whatever you want to call it. This is being made for the Lincoln Steampunk Festival that you probably have seen that I attend yearly. And what I normally do with that festival is to start work on a new piece for it, usually around sort of June, July sort of time, maybe a bit earlier each year. But what I found was that because I was also participating in the original mecha contest, I ended up in a situation where I would have to sort of pause my work on the original mecha contest, start work on the piece for the asylum, then once I came back from the asylum I would then continue with the original mecha contest piece. And the thing about the festival is that there are so many amazing costumes and really cool stuff there that you tend to come back infused with ideas for steampunk items once you've attended the festival. So I ended up in a situation where I needed to go back to working on my original mecha contest piece, but all of the ideas in my head were steampunk ideas. So I suppose one thing I could do is maybe make a steampunk mech, maybe for the contest. But what I decided to do was actually start on my piece for the Asylum Festival for next year now, immediately after this year's festival. That way I can use all of that sort of creative energy on a steampunk piece, and that has meant that I haven't finished my piece for the original mecha contest yet, so I've probably missed the deadline by the time this goes out, which is a bit of a shame, but unfortunately you just kind of got to go where the creative winds take you. So in this video we're going to be looking at putting together this piece, so let's get started. So the first step of this was making a form that would fit my head in foam, and what I've done is to build this over a plaster cast that I made in my head probably a couple of years back now. This isn't the best way of doing this, so only do this if you really know what you're doing. You know, there's always a danger that you won't be able to free yourself afterwards. Luckily this one turned out, as you can probably guess, but nevertheless be a little bit careful if you're going to try this. But what that does mean is I've got a basic shape of my head. What I've done is to cut some pieces of foam to size, super glue those in place over this shape. So once I've covered this in fiberglass, this should then give me a rigid form that will fit my head exactly. I've mentioned before, but fiberglass is comprised of two components. There's a glass fibre mesh that you can see me putting on the shape here, and that's all bound together with a resin, which in this case is a polyester resin. So I'm covering the shape in fiberglass, and that will give me a firm structure to work against. So I've let that dry for a few hours. I can now take the shape off the form. Now I haven't made this super thick, so there's a bit of give to it, which is handy. So that means I can get this off relatively easily. It still takes a little bit of work, as you can see. So I'm just giving this a little bit of clear up. Right, so I feel a bit like Pound Shop Magneto here, but the helmet does at least fit quite snugly, so that's good. So that's a basis that I can now work on. So now I need to chop this down to size. So what I'm doing is just marking where my eyes and the corners of my mouth are. So that will just give me some marks to work against, so I know where everything is. So I can now start cutting this down to size using the Dremel. So I also need to make a piece that will work for the lower half of the mask, and at the minute this is all just very rough. I'm using these as a basic structure to work against, essentially a framework. So once I have the shapes in place, I can then start adding bits to them to try and build the mask up. And the first part of that is to use these, which I've got off eBay, and these are some military headphones. I always find that building in some ready-made objects into the piece just gives it a sort of an air of authenticity. So what I'm going to do is pull these apart and use some of the shapes in the mask. Right, so I think these ear sections are going to look quite nice on the sides. I've also been given this really cool machined aluminium piece. This came from an engineering company that a friend of mine did some work for, and I'm thinking of putting it on the back, but I think it might be a little big. Nevertheless, that's a possibility. So what I'm going to do is just hot glue these things together initially. What I'm doing first off is just making sure that I have the orientation of these things correct. It's very easy to get these things a bit kind of wonky and then get halfway through the project and then realise, so it really pays to make sure you've got everything aligned correctly. Using hot glue is great because if I don't like the positioning, I can usually fairly easily pull them apart, and if I really need to I can just use a heat gun to melt the glue. So these things are sort of infinitely repositionable in that sense. So I'm just trying to make sure I've got these in the right position before I go forward. Now what I want to have is a way of taking the front part of the mask off separately to the back. So I want to have a way of attaching these things together that can come apart. So what I've done here is just to make a basic shape out of some foam board. So this is just temporary. This is so I can get an idea of how the shapes will come together. I ended up chopping the mask down even further. Those bits that were going over the front of my face were just going to get in the way in the end, because I had to sort of bend the mask to get it onto my head, and that's not going to be good for putting it on once it's finished. So I've sort of cut those down, and what I'm going to do is try and make a interface here between the front of the mask and the back. So what I've done is to cut the foam board shape I had out in acrylic, and what I've got are some threaded inserts. So what I'm going to do is have a way of turning these thumb screws, and that will allow me to bolt the two halves of the mask together. So at the minute I've got a few pieces of acrylic bolted to the back of the mask, and what I need to do is attach the front piece to those in the correct orientation. This is a little bit tricky because I can't really do it while I'm wearing it, and although I've got the plaster copy of my head, it's by no means a proper live cast. It's a little bit sort of lumpy and not quite right, so it's only good as a rough guide. So I'm kind of having to just guess at some of this, but like before, I'm using hot glue, so if I need to reposition this I can. So it's really just a bit of trial and error to get this into the correct shape. Okay, that sort of works. I mean, as I mentioned, this is not the final piece by any stretch of the imagination. This is really just a framework to build against. So what I've settled on is actually using this piece on the back of the mask, and this is the back of my airbrush air compressor, which broke a while back. It's got this kind of cool ribbed shape, which looks pretty cool, so I think that's going to look quite nice on the back. I'm also going to have some computer fans for ventilation, and I can also dress the mask with these various bits of electronics I've got here as well. So I'm just trying to figure out how this will look on the back of the mask and where things will sit. So what I've done is to take the back of the air compressor, a piece of acrylic on the back of it. What I now need to do is just cut that down so it can fit the contours of the mask. I'm also going to put some fans on the back, so what I'm doing is cutting out an opening there so air can flow through. So I've filled in the back underneath the air compressor piece as well as I can with acrylic, but there's always some gaps, so I'm using some Bondo here to fill those in. And it's the same for the headphone pieces as well. So what I need to do is make some shapes that can hide the computer fans, and these pieces of piping I think will work quite well, so I'm going to put these around the computer fans here, and I can glue those in place. I also want to have some ventilation at the top of the mask, and this is something I tried for one of the steampunk masks a couple of years back. You can see some footage here of me trying to do it. Now the problem I had with this one, and actually most of the masks I've made, is I sort of made the mask first and then thought about how I would fit in ventilation and electronics afterwards. So the design of the mask always came first over the functionality. What I'm trying to do here is build the mask with the functionality in mind straight from the beginning. So what I'm doing is creating some channels on top of the mask that the computer fans will be attached to. What I've learned over the years through making masks is that the best way to have some ventilation in the mask is actually to suck air out of it. Sounds a bit counterintuitive, but because the mask is never going to be airtight, what that does is create a bit of a low pressure environment inside the mask, and that then sucks air into the mask through all the gaps. So what that means is if you pull air out of the mask, it creates airflow as air comes in to fill that low pressure environment. So that creates quite a nice bit of airflow within the mask and should make things quite comfortable. So all I'm doing here is just building up a basic shape in styrene plastic to create some channels. Now this is going to look really rough, but what I'm going to do is cover it in fiberglass once I've got the basic shape in place, and then smooth that down with Bondo and so forth. So although it's going to look rough initially, eventually this will be incorporated into the shape of the mask. Okay, there you go. So there's the basic shape. Obviously it looks really rough, but what I'm now going to do is come in and cover this in fiberglass, and that should help me start smoothing it out and also give it a bit more strength. Okay, so once the fiberglass is dry, I can now cover it in Bondo and start sanding that down to a smooth finish. Right, there we go. So as you can see, that's sort of fairly well blended into the shape of the mask. I mean, you can't really tell there's a channel on the top just by looking at it from the side, but on the front, obviously, you can see the air intakes there. And on the back, we've got some space for the fans to sit as well. So now coming in and further smoothing out the shape that I've created, and I'm using some epoxy here to fill in more gaps and try and sort of basically incorporate all these shapes into one piece. I want this to look like a finished, designed, manufactured piece. I think a lot of the stuff that I've made in the past can sometimes look a bit slapdash, as though I've sort of added things as I've gone along, and that's exactly how I work, so it's understandable that it would look that way. But for this one, I wanted it to look like something that had been manufactured and designed from scratch, so I'm sort of taking care to make sure all of these shapes fit together in a sort of a logical way. So now that the epoxy is set, I can now come in and start sanding all that down. So I'm a fair way through sort of blending all these pieces together, so what I'm going to do is take all the hardware off and give it a layer of undercoat. That just lets you see where all the imperfections in the finish are. So what I now want to do is make a piece for my nose and mouth, and the reason for that is that one of the main issues when you're wearing a mask is it can heat up from your breath. As you breathe out, you exhale water vapour and obviously warm gas, and in an enclosed environment that can very quickly cause the mask to heat up and the water vapour to collect on the inside of the mask. So you need a way of venting that out so that doesn't happen. And what's also useful is if you can cover your nose and mouth and have the air come out separately to the rest of the helmet, that means that water vapour and hot gas and so forth won't collect in the mask itself. It will only collect in the area where your nose and mouth are. So what I'm trying to do is sort of isolate my breath from the rest of the mask, and that should hopefully help keep the mask cool as well. So I've made this basic shape in foam. What I now need to do is sort of glue this into the framework that I've got in the correct orientation so it will cover my nose and mouth. So I'm just trying to sort of get a basic idea of where this will sit. So what I need to do is cut this shape out of the fiberglass frame that I've got. Okay, so there you go. You can see that's sort of basically fitting in okay. I've just got this sort of lightly glued in place so it will sort of hold its orientation. But I think that looks okay. So what I'm going to do before I completely fix that in place is cover the whole thing in fiberglass as well, so I've got a solid form to work against. So there we go, so I've got that glued in place, and I think that looks about right. So what I can now do is start cutting away some of the fiberglass shape that I've got and start integrating these two shapes together. So what I can now do is come in with more fiberglass and sort of start joining that together really solidly. So once this is all set, this is going to be pretty strong. Obviously it's a bit of a mess, so I need to clean this up quite thoroughly. So at this point I'm trying to figure out what the overall aesthetic of the mask should be. I've been thinking about having some sort of flaps on top of it, which is similar to the Union Jack mask I made a while back. Also thinking about having a sort of a unit on the side which could contain lenses and so forth. So I'm just trying to sort of figure out what a basic idea of how this should look. I'm not sure the cardboard's really doing me much favours there, but nevertheless you sort of get a basic idea of where I'm going with that. So for the nose and mouth, what I want to have are some fans there to sort of vent my breath outside the mask. And I've got these perforated steel tubes, which I'm thinking of using there. And I think they should look quite cool. I can have some fans inside to help with some air movement. So I'm using some more epoxy here to try and blend some shapes together to build up the sort of jaw section of the mask. Okay, so there you go. You can sort of get a basic idea of how the lower section of the mask is going to look there. So as before, it's just a question of sanding and sanding and sanding to try and get all these things smooth and make them look like one solid shape. And what I can also do is cut out the apertures here, which will allow air to flow in and out of the mask. So I'm now turning my attention to the faceplate of the mask, and I'm building up a basic shape in foam here, and that will help me build a frame that I can then put fiberglass over. It took a little bit back and forth to get a shape that I like, but I quite like this sort of bulbous forehead kind of look. It makes sense because the air intakes are just below this, so it's going to allow airflow through my face, and the helmet is going to be pressing against my forehead, so I think that should be quite comfortable to wear. Also gives it kind of a cool look, I think. I mean, obviously there's going to be some eye apertures in here as well, but as a basic shape, I quite like the look of that. So I'm going to go ahead now and cover this thing in fiberglass. Okay, that's now set. Obviously a bit of a mess, but it needs a bit of clear up. But I've got a solid shape I can work with now. So I can now clean that up with the Dremel. And as before, it's a question of sanding this smooth and using Bondo to fill out the form and slowly build that up into a smooth shape that I can work with. And a layer of undercoat will help me see where all the imperfections are. So I've been looking at the air intakes for the mouth section, and I've got these perforated steel tubes with computer fans in, but I need some additional detail to help sell these as a sort of a steampunk gizmo. So what I've got are these light fittings, and what I've done is to cut them down and use these ring sections. It turns out that the screw thread for the light fitting is exactly the diameter to fit inside the perforated steel tube, so that's really useful. And what I've done is just trim that down a little bit further on the lathe so that these rings will fit over as well. It's usually the way these sorts of things, that these things sort of fit together almost, but not quite exactly. So sometimes you're lucky, but other times you have to adjust things to fit. So I'm just cutting a channel into this on the lathe so that these things will fit together a bit more exactly. Right, there we go. So you can see how that will look. I think that's looking pretty good. And jumping forward a little bit, what I've done is to put some bolts in there to hold them in place. So what I now need to do is think about putting some eyes in so I can see where I'm going. And I've got these various brass bushes, so they're basically brass rings. They're used for plumbing, but they're really, really useful for lens holders. So what I'm trying to do here is just cut some holes into the mask so I can fit these in. And I'm just having to be a little bit careful about positioning here. I want to make sure I don't get things looking too wonky. And I've got a choice here of a couple of different sizes of rings, so I'm sort of going to start with the smaller ones, and if I don't like the look, I'll then widen those holes and use the larger ones. So I'm just drawing some guides on the mask here so I can see where things should lie. Now a few little holes in there allow me to put the mask on and see through, just to make sure the orientation's in place, and it seems pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and cut some wider holes in there so that the lens pieces can fit in. Right, so what I can see, so that's good, and actually visibility's pretty good from inside here actually, so that's cool. I mean, one of the things I really want to focus on with this is A, comfort, but B, also I need to be able to see, and some of the masks I've made previously have had varying levels of visibility. The main one being that you often lose your peripheral vision, which is fine, but because I'm generally going to be wearing this at a festival, there's a lot of people about, so you kind of need to see who's around you, so having some peripheral vision in this is going to be really, really useful. So I'm going to widen these in a little bit to allow some mesh on the sides of the lens pieces, and that should allow me to see just to the left and right a little bit better than I normally would be able to in a mask, and hopefully I won't then bump into anybody in the festival. So what I also want to do is add some additional lenses on here to give the idea that there's some sort of sensors in the mask perhaps, just some steampunk gizmos basically. So again, I'm being quite careful with the orientation of these, making sure they're not wonky or anything. Once I'm happy with it, I can then come in with some epoxy and various other bits to make sure these are solidly attached to the mask. So what I also need to do is permanently fix the main eye apertures in place, and in order to get the orientation right, what I've done is to make a basic frame out of styrene plastic. So what I want to do is glue this in place, and then once they're securely in there I can then cut the frame away, and that should allow me to retain the orientation of the eye apertures so everything's straight. Okay, so there we go. So now there's a bit of framework to hold those pieces in place. And as you can see, there's some gaps on the sides. So what I want to do is actually fill those in with mesh so I can see out of them, and that should allow me to have some peripheral vision when I'm wearing it. So you can see some mesh in place. I think that looks pretty good from sort of an aesthetic point of view, but it'll also allow me to see, so that's pretty good. Now, I'm also thinking about what else can I add to the mask. Obviously there's some large blank spaces here, and I want to fill them in with some steampunk detail. And what I've got here is a cupboard door hinge, and this is one of those occasions where I was thinking, well, they look obviously like cupboard door hinges to me, these things, and when I see them in costumes I always spot them, but I don't know how common that will be, whether other people will see it and go straight away cupboard door hinge. Some will, some won't, but every so often you find a piece which is just perfect, and this just happens to fit this section of the mask perfectly and looks like a really cool mechanical detail. It also, I think, is going to serve a practical function. I think it's going to work as a bit of a latch to allow the faceplate to come off, so I'm thinking of adding this on the centre like that, and I think that should look quite nice. I need to add some additional mechanical detailing as well, of course, but I think that's going to be quite a nice centrepiece. So I'm just cutting down the fitment because I don't need these screw attachments. Okay, so that's now bolted in place, and I think that's looking pretty good. So the forehead of the mask was something I was really struggling with. For a while I was thinking, well, maybe there could be some sort of pull-down visor perhaps that looked like it was movable. That meant I needed another curved shape that would fit over the forehead of the mask, and so to that end what I'm doing here is try and melt down some warbler, which is a cosplay material. It's like a thermoplastic. It feels a little bit like cardboard infused with sugar actually, and you can melt it with a heat gun. It's quite useful for this sort of thing, because you can very easily melt it over a contour and it will take that form. So I thought this might be quite a nice way of getting that contoured shape, and I could then come in with some Bondo afterwards to smooth it all out. So this was an avenue I was exploring for a while, but ultimately I decided not to go this way. So instead what I decided to do was return to an idea that I had at the beginning of this, was to add some sort of flaps on the sides. As I mentioned, this is something that I used for my Union Jack mask several years back, but I thought this might be a nice place to revisit the idea. So as you can see on the front, I've got some pieces of Meccano mixed in there as well. For those unfamiliar, Meccano is an old construction toy, kind of a little bit like Lego I suppose, but this was all like metal and bolts, and you could make sort of shapes and vehicles and things out of it. I remember it from when I was young, but I don't really see it in the shops anymore, so I think it's probably one of those old sort of toys. And nevertheless, it has all of these really cool mechanical shapes, which are quite useful. So as with the cupboard door hinge, I'm hoping the Meccano isn't too obvious to people. It will be to some, but hopefully not everybody. But nevertheless, they've got these core mechanical pieces, so I'm going to incorporate some of these in. And I think that some brass shapes here will probably add some nice mechanical detailing to it. So what I'm going to do is cut out a shape in some brass sheets here. And what I've done is to attach that, I'm using some rivets to some Meccano pieces. I think that's looking quite nice. I quite like the silver colour against the brass. I think that's looking quite nice. So I think that's going to look quite nice there. So I'm just drilling some holes in the shape here and putting some bolts through to hold that in place. So what we've also got is a piece for the top here, and I've got another piece of cupboard door hinge to hold that in place. This is one that I've cut down a little bit. I only had half of it. I must have used it for a previous project a while back. But I think sort of just continuing that sort of design aesthetic effectively, using similar shapes from the cupboard door hinges in other places in the costume is going to sort of just tie things together and hopefully make it not look too slapdash. So what I've done is to tap some screw threads into the piece that I've got here, and that'll allow me to screw these pieces together. So that's going to sit on top like that. And jumping ahead, I've got that attached, and that was a little bit of a faff sort of attaching that together, so I didn't video me doing that, so it was quite fiddly. But I think that looks quite nice like that. Okay, so there we go. So it's sort of looking like a thing now. Still a fair bit to do. I was worrying a little bit with this because it's getting quite heavy. It's sort of about 2.5 kilos now, which is quite heavy. I think I looked online and motorcycle helmets are usually like sort of 1.5 to 2 kilos. So this is heavier than a motorcycle helmet. Nevertheless, I've worn it for a while and it seems okay. My neck isn't hurting really, so fingers crossed it'll be okay. I think once there's a bit of padding in it, it should be quite nice. So that's to do. I've got to make sort of a leather neck piece and interior padding to make it comfortable to wear. I've got to hook up the electronics. Obviously I've got to paint it as well. So fair bit to do, but for the time being that's where we are. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.